Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Accelerating Clinical Development with Expanded Access, presented by RO. I'm Michael Shoshua, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Kevin Barber, Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Submissions at RO, and Mark Shapiro, Partner, Pharma Initiatives Consulting, and Chief Operating Officer of XCures. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Let's begin. Kevin, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our discussion about expanded access and how it can accelerate your clinical development for products to treat serious conditions. I'm very excited that Mark Shapiro has joined me today for this presentation. Mark has a wealth of experience and knowledge regarding expanded access and implementation of expanded access and how it can be integrated into a product development program. So I'm very, very glad Mark could join us today. Well, we just wanted to start with a brief outline of what we want to cover for our webinar today. We want to briefly discuss what expanded access is, the history of expanded access in the United States, the regulatory framework and the procedures involved very briefly. And then we wanted to do a dive into how expanded access can support your development program, including the utility of data generated under an expanded access program, and then strategic considerations for your program and aligning with FDA on the use of expanded access to move your product development forward. So with that, to sort of get the ball rolling and maybe break the ice for the webinar, so to speak, we did want to start out by touching on some myths or misperceptions, mistaken beliefs about expanded access that have come up quite a bit over the years. I know in the course of my career, and I'm sure this is true for Mark as well, I think I've heard each of these myths brought up by sponsors as arguments basically against doing an expanded access program for a product development. And you can read through these. I'm not going to read through all of these out loud, but they basically fall into, I would say, perhaps three big buckets. One bucket of an excuse that there's no real incentive to do expanded access other than to avoid bad publicity. Another bucket that expanded access would have a very bad impact on your development program by generating negative data or poor quality data, or by diverting patients away from your primary clinical trials in your development program. And a third bucket that, just generally speaking, a perception that expanded access is incredibly burdensome, very resource draining, and that FDA is basically a roadblock when it comes to expanded access. And I think overall the two primary excuses that I consistently hear is a fear that if you do expanded access, you're going to generate serious adverse events from sicker patients in an expanded access program that could lead to a clinical hold for your corporate IND, and that expanded access, quite frankly, requires too many sponsor resources. So as we go through our discussions today, I hope you see that none of the myths and misperceptions and beliefs that we have listed here are really true. So now, as some background, we'd like to take a few moments to discuss what expanded access is, including the goals and the requirements for an expanded access program. So generally speaking, I mean, the reason for the existence of expanded access, the overarching goal is to afford patients with immediately life-threatening conditions or serious diseases to gain access to a product that is under development, to an investigational product that is not yet available commercially, so that these patients can obtain the investigational product and be treated outside of clinical trials in situations where there's really no other alternative therapy available for them. So again, the idea here is to treat these patients and afford them the opportunity to access these products, but without any undue risk for the patient or any undue impact on the development of the product itself and any ongoing trials, and to do this under the auspices of regulatory oversight by the FDA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to discuss further expanded access and at a high level its requirements.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mark?
It's great to be here. Thank you. It's great to be here. I think in thinking about or talking about what expanded access is, I think to me the easiest way to summarize it is pre-approval access to investigational medication. At least that's what we call it in the U.S. Outside the U.S., there are many different names for this type of pre-approval access. But I think a good catch-all term that a lot of people use colloquially is compassionate use, and that's what we're talking about. As you mentioned, Kevin, in the U.S., expanded access is an FDA-regulated process, and the requirements are outlined in 21 CFR 312.305, which of course is the same section that covers all of the IND requirements. It's notable that expanded access has a slightly different intent. So the intent here is treatment rather than research. But other aspects of the IND regulations still apply, such as the requirement for informed consent, a requirement for IRB review, and other core aspects that are required when conducting a study under an IND. And that expanded access programs can fall into many different types. I think when we were talking about this before, there's at least 7 types in the United States, and they can be for various different clinical situations, including emergency or non-emergency uses. As I mentioned, outside the U.S., there's many similar mechanisms, but this in general is an area that's less harmonized than clinical research conducted under ICH GCP. So you may hear it called many different things. The main requirements for expanded access are a serious or life-threatening illness, and I think it's sometimes believed that this has to be life-threatening, but oftentimes we do see expanded access programs for chronic but serious conditions. They are very common in oncology and infectious disease, and there has been, I think, a huge increase in awareness and hopefully understanding about these programs over the last 18 months. The FDA has processed about 100 times more expanded access requests than the typical volume prior to COVID-19. One main requirement is no other comparable or satisfactory therapeutic options, but this doesn't mean that the patient has tried every single thing. It's really what's in the best interest of the patient in the opinion of their treating physician. And so there's wide latitude and a lot of deference to the treating clinician's decision-making process. And in terms of the myths we talked about, so expanded access is reserved for people who can't participate in clinical trials, but that specifically includes people who can't travel. And of course, these are generally sick patients, so travel is either sometimes an economic burden or hardship due to their health and condition. And oftentimes, expanded access is used for patients who don't qualify, either because of age exclusions or comorbidity exclusions in controlled clinical trials, or in terms of bridging, when a patient may have been eligible for a clinical trial, but a cohort is closed, or the cohort they could have participated in is closed, or even between studies. For example, between phase 1 and phase 2, a company might want to open an expanded access program in order to make the product available for patients who otherwise would have been eligible. Kevin, would you like to talk about the history of expanded access?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Mark. And so we want to just briefly review the history of expanded access in the United States in case you're not familiar with it. But to give you some insight into how it's evolved over the past couple of decades. So this really goes back to the 1970s with a period of time in which citizen pressure arising out of patient advocacy for example, for patients with cancer, and again, the AIDS crisis that arose back in the 70s, 80s, through the 90s, with citizen pressure that led to early expanded access processes. And as Mark's already mentioned, there's a lot of different terms that apply to this, including named patient, early access, compassionate use. And this culminated in 1987 with the first FDA regulations for expanded access that were promulgated in 21 CFR 312, 34, and 35, covering treatment INDs and treatment protocols. And so under the auspices of FDA's regulations for a couple of decades, companies functioned utilizing treatment INDs and treatment protocols to treat single or multiple patients under the expanded access paradigm such as it existed at the time. And then in 2009, as Mark will discuss here a little bit further on for the regulatory framework, the regulations were extensively updated into a new subpart I within 21 CFR 312 that covered the different domains of expanded access such as they exist today. And Mark will describe that a bit more in a moment. But then beyond 2009, FDA tried to listen to complaints, in particular for investigators trying to do individual patient expanded access, that it was cumbersome. So they developed a streamlined process and a streamlined form, FDA Form 3926, to capture the elements of individual patient expanded access rather than having to operate under the full IND paradigm, to try to make it easier for physicians and individual investigators to manage it. And then as a result of the 21st Century Cures Act in 2017, specific requirements were put in place for companies to be outward facing with respect to their expanded access policies and make those publicly available. And then moving forward into 2018, 2019, FDA continued to try to refine the material available to industry, to individual patients, to investigators and treating physicians regarding what's involved in expanded access and how to do it. That culminated in a relatively user-friendly FDA webpage on expanded access, and we have the link here. So if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. And hand in hand with that, FDA also made a commitment to dedicate resources and personnel to support expanded access. And as we continue forward in our discussion today, I think you'll see evidence of FDA's commitment to expanded access in terms of making products available to treat patients with serious diseases. So at this point, I do want to turn it back over to Mark to talk about the regulatory framework and at a high level the processes involved in expanded access.
Thank you, Kevin. So for me, the mental model of expanded access, which I find helpful, is to think about the different mechanisms outlined in CFR as somewhat analogous to the different stages of drug development. So single patient expanded access programs, and there are a few different mechanisms for different clinical situations, are typically things that you would think about early in development, around the time of phase 1 or phase 1 and phase 2 of your development program. And these can be very much tailored to the individual situation. So Kevin mentioned the Form 3926, which really streamlines the process of an investigator IND for a single patient. If you've ever done a traditional investigator IND, it's a lot of work, and it requires more expertise than most busy clinicians have. So the 3926 was a deliberate effort to make that single patient IND process much easier. And, that allows the sponsor to allow a physician to conduct it under their own IND and take on those obligations. Single patient programs can also be done under sponsor INDs. And it's important to note that the FDA, as part of the efforts to streamline this, issued guidance clarifying that a single IRB reviewer is allowed for single patient expanded access. And I would note that most IRBs will waive a review fee in that setting. Intermediate expanded access programs, which are less common, might be more typically thought of as analogous to phase 2. This, as I mentioned, is more than a little and less than a lot. In my personal experience, between 5 and 10 single patient IND requests will typically trigger a request from the agency to consolidate under an intermediate protocol. And this is largely for their convenience in terms of trying to manage and coordinate across now multiple open INDs of the same product. These can be granted either to a sponsor IND or under a completely new IND. And they tend to be for an intermediate-sized population, which, again, is not defined in the regulations, but should typically not widely outpace the stage of development. So it should be roughly on the same order of magnitude as the number of patients so far exposed in general. And because this is a protocol for a defined, albeit more broadly defined population than a clinical trial, a full IRB review is required. And then the largest stage of expanded access is a treatment IND or treatment protocol. And these typically provide the role of offering expanded access during the period of time following the completion of pivotal studies, but before a commercial approval of a product. And so this corresponds to widespread use, typically along the lines of the population expected in the approved labeling. And because it is protocol-based, a full review is required. On this table, Kevin and I have outlined a summary of the different options and some comparisons. I'm not going to read the table. It's there for you for reference in the future. But a couple of key points here. There's different mechanisms, including different submission forms, a traditional 1571 for all types of expanded access, or a 3926 for the investigator-sponsored single patient setting. And then it's also important to think about with expanded access that this can be a mechanism for faster access for patients, especially if there is an open IND that the expanded access protocol can be submitted to. And in that setting, it's possible to open the program without a full 30-day waiting period like a typical IND. Kevin?
Thank you, Mark. So now Mark and I, we kind of want to tag team and we want to discuss regulatory utility of the data generated by expanded access programs and give some examples and some precedent for the utilization of data coming from expanded access. Just to sort of start out, and Mark mentioned this a bit earlier as we've been discussing, but again, the intention behind expanded access is to afford patients the opportunity to be treated by an investigational product outside of the domain of a clinical development program and in particular the clinical trials that are in place for a development program. And on the other hand, again, the point of doing clinical trials and setting up and running clinical studies, including randomized controlled clinical trials, is to develop data to support the product through its development and hopefully approval process. So expanded access, intent is treatment, clinical trials, intent is research. But it's really not an either-or proposition. And as you hopefully will see as we go through this, data from expanded access can support clinical research and development for products to treat serious conditions. So I'll turn it over to Mark to expound upon this a bit, and then we'll go through some examples. So, Mark?
Thank you, Kevin. So as many of you may be aware, the FDA has a number of initiatives around real-world data and real-world evidence including issuing a new guidance or draft guidance on the topic last week. And this was driven by a section of the 21st Century Cures Act that directed FDA to evaluate how to incorporate real-world evidence into decision-making. But it should be noted that real-world evidence has been around for a long time, for example, in the form of historic controls. In the context of expanded access, we'll talk a little bit about how expanded access can be another source of real-world data because, again, these patients are typically more similar to what would be observed in the clinical practice setting rather than in a controlled research setting. As Kevin mentioned in his history section, expanded access is an area of focus. They commissioned a McKinsey study covering the period of 2012 to 2017 in order to try and understand how the process could be improved. And as part of that review, they evaluated the number of expanded access programs granted year by year. It's historically not been as widely used as you might expect, with only a few hundred single patient programs granted per year. Intermediate programs tend to be the most unusual, with only 5 to 10 programs per year. And larger scale treatment INDs and treatment protocols, as you might expect, fit more nicely with the commercial objectives of launching a new product, so making it available during that review period. And those tend to correspond primarily to pending approvals of new products for serious or life-threatening diseases. But they did highlight a couple of key points, and I think some of the myths and misperceptions that it's rare for FDA to reject an expanded access request. In fact, CDER noted during that period that they had not denied any requests. CBER is a little bit more challenging, and my own experience with them for expanded access bears this out, that because of the nature of biologic products, it sometimes takes more explanation and it may be more difficult. I think Peter Marks had noted at one point that the rejections in his group were really related to difficulty understanding what the product even was. But of course, FDA may have legitimate manufacturing questions that are harder to answer for a biologic. So it's a little more difficult in that setting. And then another important misperception is the risk of learning something that might derail your research program. During that period of study, there were only 2 deaths in 10,000 plus applications, which led to transient clinical holds. But it's important to note that the FDA recognizes these are sicker patients, and the incidents in question actually involve things that would have delayed or caused a clinical hold regardless of the setting in which they occurred. But more importantly, there's been a huge expansion of expanded access in the last year, with more than 50,000 patients in the U.S. treated under this mechanism in 2020. So I wanted to share a little bit of what I believe to be the FDA's perspective on this from my various discussions with different members of the agency about this. And I would note that, for example, Richard Pazder, the head at the Oncology Center for Excellence, had been through this firsthand as a senior FDA official with his wife, and he's spoken about this on a number of occasions. And I can't help but think that this experience and some of the challenges that they faced navigating this process, even as an insider, led to some of the agency's, I would say, really serious efforts to streamline this process. And they've done a lot, including issuing a new frequently asked questions document and a guidance document, and even taking the 3926 and building it in app form so that you could complete it as a physician on your mobile phone. They also told me that they repeatedly advocate for small companies, biotech companies that are going to be developing drugs in this serious or life-threatening domain to post their policy proactively. And in addition to the requirement to post on the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA website, it's also a lot easier now to cross-post this on clinicaltrials.gov. And clinicaltrials.gov has been updated to make that more straightforward. But the FDA gets requests from patients, and they, are not in a situation to grant them, but they don't necessarily want to feel like they're being blamed for not making the products available. So I do think they really do their part to encourage and assist sponsors who are thinking about doing this. I would say that I typically hear some skepticism about the data quality around efficacy of compassionate programs, but this, I think, is historically because it hasn't been an area of enforcement for the agency, right? These are physicians who are typically trying to do the right thing on behalf of their patients, and the FDA recognizes that, there is good intent behind these. And of course, there's nothing stopping sponsors from producing high-quality data in expanded access programs. And I think that's an important point to think about, that, there are sponsors and there are plenty of examples of people who really do a good job with this. There's some optionality available. So, the data, of course, needs to be Part 11 compliant if it's collected in an electronic system. But there's different approaches towards source document verification or chart review and risk-based monitoring that are all possible. And I would say that most medical reviewers, actually I would say almost uniformly, I've heard that this is useful for a medical reviewer, that it gives them a sense of the directionality of the safety data and, can help boost their confidence in the decision-making process, that the direction and magnitude of the safety signals observed in controlled trials correspond to that in expanded access, or let's say the more real-world setting. So as I mentioned, expanded access can generate meaningful real-world data, right? These are more representative patients, people who are more like the ones who would get a drug in commercial supply. So they're more heterogeneous. They may have more severe disease, more comorbidities, more concomitant medications, all of which can be informative for sponsors, especially in these populations where polypharmacy may be common. These can be early signals of how physicians may use the product, what they may combine it with. And so there's important practical knowledge to be gained from these programs if the data is collected. And so, sponsors can leverage this in many different ways. Expanded access data has proved valuable for many companies, not just in enhancing discussions with regulators about the broadness of a proposed label, but particularly with payers when looking at pricing negotiations. And, this is early real-world data that supports that. And of course, clinicians, they want to understand not just data from clinical trials, but, what does the product do and how does it operate in their patients, or patients who are, more real-world patients than the ones in the controlled trials. Kevin?
Thank you, Mark. So Mark noted a moment ago that FDA has been sort of skeptical about the quality of efficacy data coming from expanded access and compassionate use sort of historically. So we thought it would be useful to take a moment to discuss the regulatory precedents for FDA's reliance on efficacy data from expanded access in supporting drug approvals. And actually, last year, there was a pretty nice review published in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology entitled Expanded Access as a Source of Real-World Data, an overview of FDA and EMA approvals. And in this review, the authors basically conducted a comprehensive search focusing on FDA in this discussion. They conducted a comprehensive search of FDA approval documents for various terms associated with expanded access. And they found that, looking backwards as far as they could, several decades, that 126 approvals by FDA for drug products have referenced data from expanded access. And drilling down on efficacy, they found that 25 of these products were approved by FDA using data from expanded access to support efficacy for the product. And the earliest one in particular was way back in 1993. So, pushing 30 years ago for expanded access for clarithromycin that involved 469 patients in an expanded access program. And just generally looking at the numbers from 1993 to 2013, so over a 20-ish year period of time, based on this review, there were 14 drugs approved by FDA using data from expanded access for efficacy. But then over the 4 to 5 year period from 2014 to 2018, 11 drugs were approved by FDA. So it went up from less than 1 per year for a couple of decades to more than 2 per year just over the last few years. So I think that's a bit of evidence that more and more sponsors are starting to rely upon expanded access and compassionate use to generate useful efficacy data. And then drilling down on those 25 approvals that relied on efficacy data from expanded access or utilized it, 11 of those approvals relied on data from expanded access as actual pivotal efficacy data. This included, again, the breakdown here, 5 metabolic disorders, 2 hematology and oncology products, 2 infectious disease products, and 2 products to treat overdosing. So, that's not an insignificant number. It's not large, but 11 products using expanded access data as pivotal is pretty compelling as precedence. And for 4 out of these 11 products, expanded access data was actually the only source, the sole source of evidence for efficacy in the application to the FDA. So if you haven't, you should take an opportunity, maybe pull this up and take a look at it, see if you agree with their methodology in this review. But I thought this was an interesting review, drilling down on efficacy to show and demonstrate the utility of expanded access data to support efficacy of drug products. I would note that this product did not review biologic products. So what Mark and I would like to do is touch on a couple of case studies, including the first one that we have here is a biologic product. This is actually a product that I had the opportunity almost 20 years ago to work on the expanded team that was involved in pulling together the BLA for this product. This is an intravenous immune globulin product called Baby Big that was approved back in 2003 to treat infant botulism, and it was developed by the California Department of Health Services. And the interesting and compelling thing from an expanded access standpoint is that the development program for this product relied upon 1 randomized controlled clinical trial involving 129 patients. But then for efficacy, it relied upon 144 patients coming from some open label expanded access studies under compassionate use and emergency and treatment INDs. And these data were very useful. The primary efficacy endpoint was a very objective endpoint looking at the length of hospital stay as well as the length of stay in the ICU. And so these data coming from the open label expanded access studies provided confirmatory efficacy data for the randomized controlled trial to support approval of this biologic product. And then beyond the efficacy data, of course, the 129 and 144 subjects from the controlled trial in the open label expanded access were augmented by an additional 149 subjects from treatment IND patients. So the vast majority of the patients supporting safety for Baby Big came from expanded access. I'm going to turn it over to Mark to run through a couple of drug case studies now.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to note, too, that there's a bunch of good questions in the chat and that Kevin and I will address them when we get through the rest of the slides. And I think I'm looking forward to it. I think there's some interesting situations described there that'll be fun to talk about. So Lutathera is an interesting, but I think a really good example of how My audio cut off. Hopefully you can hear me again. So I was going to talk about case. Okay, thank you. I'll talk about Lutathera. Lutathera is a radiopharmaceutical. It was an example, I think, of how a company that's particularly good at expanded access, which is Novartis, was able to utilize the program for an approved labeling while at the same time avoiding doing a second pivotal study. So this is a product for GPNet. It's a rare neuroendocrine tumor. They did a randomized controlled trial. This is an open label study with 221 patients. And in parallel, there was a long-running expanded access program for the product. They did a retrospective analysis of more than 1,200 patients and collected the GPNet subgroup, which had 360 patients, so somewhat larger than the pivotal study. And this was a retrospective chart review and collection, so they databased this data. And the FDA was willing to accept that in lieu of a second pivotal trial and granted a full approval to Lutathera in this indication. So, it's an example of a larger expanded access program, but it's a program that was enabled and accelerated, including avoiding a full pivotal trial. The next example I'm going to talk about is Epidiolex. So this is a product for refractory pediatric epilepsies. And the sponsor had made it available through 25 single patient INDs before they moved to a larger multi-center treatment protocol with 25 sites. And in the combined analysis, there are more than 600 patients, so this is a pretty good size safety database. And the patients in the expanded access program had a wide range of exposure to the product, from 2 to approximately 2.5 years on treatment. But they only had a limited data collection, and I say limited because I think this was a really a smart use of data collection. They collected patient diaries of seizure frequencies from the caregivers, as well as spontaneous reports of adverse events. So pretty lightweight. But this data was strongly correlative for the rest of their pivotal program. And so the FDA noted in their review a remarkable concordance on the safety data with the clinical trials, even though the patients in this group had much more severe disease, including more frequent seizures. And that the reviewer noted that it gave them confidence in the decision-making process about the expected adverse event rate. So if you think 607 patients, pretty sizable addition to the overall safety database. The other thing that I think was really well done here was that the effectiveness data on the seizure control was useful. So this supported publication and presentation at meetings. It was used in their medical affairs product launch and in reimbursement negotiations. And they showed that patients in this experienced approximately a 50% reduction in seizure frequency. So it's a good example of efficacy data having functional use, even if it wasn't the main driver of a new label or new label indication. And then another example of a company that's very effective here, Ultragenics, which makes Mepsevii. And in this case, this is an ultra-rare condition, MPS type 7. There were only 17 patients in the integrated summary of efficacy for this product. 3 from their open label studies, 12 from a randomized controlled trial, and 2 patients in the expanded access program. So if you think about 2 out of 17, this is a pretty sizable proportion of their overall efficacy data coming from expanded access. But I think most compelling was the FDA medical reviewer noting that the most compelling evidence for the treatment effect actually came from one of the patients in an emergency IND expanded access program. And this was a patient where, this is a progressive disease, but the patient was able to significantly reduce the amount of time that they spent each day on a ventilator, as well as enough functional improvement to use assistive communication technology. And so I think, powerful anecdotes can be effective in the review process, and this is another example of where that type of data coming from an expanded access program was strongly supportive. So I'm now going to turn it over to Kevin to talk about more specifically how expanded access can accelerate and advance your program.
Thank you, Mark. So yes, hopefully, as you've seen by these examples, there are a number of ways that data from a thoughtfully planned and executed expanded access program can inform and advance your development program for a serious condition. For products that are in early stage development programs, in a situation in which perhaps there may be physicians asking for single patient use for your product, as well as some sponsor-initiated expanded access activities, you can use expanded access as an opportunity to develop data to further inform your future clinical development program. Data from patients that are outside of your primary development program and indication can develop exploratory data that might lead you in the direction of additional pipeline development programs. For example, you might collect efficacy data or pharmacodynamic data that moves you in a direction in parallel with your primary program. But overall, for these early stage development programs, expanded access can be very useful to develop PK data, PD data, preliminary safety and efficacy data to inform your program moving forward. For later stage development programs, there are a number of ways and domains that the data from expanded access can support and inform your program. It can provide real-world data, as we've been discussing, to support initial label information and claims, safety, as well as perhaps efficacy, and in the post-approval space, opportunities to expand your label. It can provide useful data, as Mark has already alluded to, data and information that can support commercial product coverage and payer reimbursement. And it can support, again, publications, medical liaison activities, engagement for patient advocates and physicians, and outreach along those lines. And of course, as we've been discussing, it can provide real-world data to serve as real-world evidence to support initial product approvals. And so with that in mind, when we're talking about expanded access efficacy data, advancing your program, as you step through your development program, efficacy support coming from expanded access can develop data for you to inform your pivotal study designs. It can develop efficacy data in subpopulations that are not included directly in your clinical trials, but that can inform your product's label and serve as supportive efficacy data. And then, as we've seen, real-world data from expanded access can serve as pivotal and confirmatory efficacy data, and perhaps serving in lieu of a randomized controlled clinical trial. In addition, as patients are being treated perhaps in the intermediate expanded access or treatment expanded access domain, you could consider alternative study designs and ways to look at those sets of patients to better inform and provide additional data supporting efficacy for your product, such as perhaps a randomized withdrawal study, if it's appropriate for the product and the indication and the patient's treatment regimen. You could take patients that are currently being treated and withdraw them from your drug in a randomized fashion and develop efficacy data in that manner. So there's a lot of different ways that expanded access can inform efficacy for your product. And likewise for safety, as we've noted in our examples, expanded access data can support safety and the risks for your product as part of the overall benefit risk for your product when you file an application, because it can provide additional patient exposures beyond your controlled clinical studies and your open label extension studies, and develop safety data in subpopulations that are not directly included in your trials to inform and provide more useful safety information in your labeling. So it can provide overall a better understanding of safety across populations beyond your randomized clinical trials. And there are circumstances to think about when real-world data, as we've noted, from expanded access could potentially replace randomized controlled clinical trials. I mean, there's obvious applications for this in rare and orphan diseases and in the oncology space, circumstances in which there are small patient populations, circumstances with a large unmet medical need where it may be unethical to run blinded randomized studies. We've noted in one of the examples an antidote, uridine triacetate, to treat chemotherapy overdosing. There are a very small number of patients were available, and it was approved based solely on 135 patients in an expanded access program. So again, overall, there are, depending on your program, your product, your indication, there's opportunities where data from expanded access can serve in lieu of data from randomized controlled trials. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you to discuss some strategic considerations for expanded access within the development program.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the sponsor perspective when running these things. And I think, there's a lot of considerations when you think about whether or to what extent your company is going to be open to expanded access. One of the things that often comes up in my experience is clinical supply, making sure that you have sufficient clinical supply for both ongoing clinical trials, non-clinical studies, as well as expanded access is sometimes difficult, and planning and manufacturing campaigns for product might be affected by doing expanded access programs. So that's an important piece to this when thinking about the scope or the scale of a program, and that it isn't a cost-free endeavor. And I think this is something where bigger companies that can write this off as a charitable or tax deduction maybe are more open in general to expanded access than small companies that are, let's say, pre-revenue stage, where that type of deduction doesn't really help them any. So there are some costs, right, in terms of producing and shipping clinical supplies. And IND holders still have obligations. So especially if you're a sponsor and you allow an expanded access program under your existing IND, you are retaining some obligations as a sponsor, and that means ensuring, for example, that the physician investigator is qualified, that SUSAR reporting happens, and that patients meet whatever protocol-defined criteria exist. So there has to be both a process and documentation involved. Now, there are mechanisms to shift the IND to the physician, and, that's a strategic decision as to whether or not to allow that. I think in some cases it de-risks it, but also raises the barrier for the physician. And many physicians are not at institutions that have a lot of infrastructure to support, let's say, IND obligations. You would find there is support for this and for investigators or physician investigators doing this in most academic hospitals that already do research. But out in clinical practice, this tends to be sort of a great unknown for physicians, and that may factor into the decision making. And of course, the IND has to be open for the population of interest. So if you have a relatively broad indication for your research IND, it might be easier to roll an expanded access protocol under that. But if it's a totally different area, it is going to require a different IND, and that might be easier to achieve under an investigator IND or 3926. In doing so, the sponsor to allow this needs to provide the physician with what's called a letter of authorization, allowing them to reference all of the preclinical and manufacturing data in the existing IND. So it's a large pharma typically plans for these things in advance, and that's what I've heard. They even plan for it from manufacturing, at least for oncology programs. certainly coming out of phase one, they think about what their strategies will be for this. It tends to be much more of a game time decision in the biotech space. And I think part of our reason for doing this is to get people to think about this proactively. It's a lot easier to do the right thing here when you thought about it in advance and there's not a physician or a patient who's calling you out on Twitter about this. So being proactive, I think, is helpful. And contracts apply. So if you're going to provide investigational products to any physician, you're going to need to do so under a contract. That contract is going to have to cover all the same things that you would in a clinical trial agreement. I will say, having negotiated a lot of these, it's pretty easy to hold firm and just, take it or leave it. You give them, your preferred terms around confidentiality, indemnity, and negligence, IP rights and things like that. And most institutions will simply accept that if there's a patient who needs treatment urgently. Often sponsors don't provide any reimbursement to institutions for this, but there's nothing that says that they can't. And sometimes institutions will ask that about, let's say from drug pharmacy costs, data entry costs. And I've seen sponsors handle this in different ways. From this is purely charitable to, we're interested in this data and we're willing to pay the site to enter it. So I would just say that, if you think about this as part of your development program and you think that it has strategic value up front, it's easier to kind of scope it out in advance. So revisiting some of our myths, the adverse events here can hurt your development program. And I would say that every reviewer I've talked to, they know that these are outside of controlled trials, that the patients are almost always more severe, have more advanced disease, more comorbidities, and that the expected outcome of the patients who are often in these is pretty dire. So they don't tend to penalize or hold the drugs responsible for this unless it's something that's obvious. And those types of obvious things, I've used the example of Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Those are real, and if that sort of thing happens in any use of an investigational agent, expanded access or compassionate use, they're going to put a hold on it until they figure it out. But in general, there really isn't a bias that comes out of these things during FDA review. I would say sometimes the FDA will say that the data is useless, but rarely, maybe never have they said that it's actually harmful for a review process. And then, I think another important myth is that you can't learn anything useful. Again, mentioning Novartis, which does a great job with this, their expanded access program for Jakafi actually changed the global practice guidelines for myelofibrosis. So if you think about a really effective use of the data that's not purely regulatory, this can be a practice-changing thing if you undertake it with the right planning in mind. And then, of course, I think one of my favorite examples, so I think most people are aware of Celgene, which was a multi-billion-dollar pharma company before it was acquired. But Celgene was not an oncology company in the 1990s. And it was actually the spouse of a patient with myeloma who had convinced a physician to do an expanded access after she'd heard a talk by Judah Folkman about the role of angiogenesis in cancer. So this was a motivated patient that really spurred an expanded access program, which led to the first approval for Celgene, which was in cancer. So that's I think a great story. Mentioning in the interest of time, quickly review a couple of key points about planning these things, but just thinking about the sponsor goals and objectives, which are tied to the development stage. Real-world data and engagement can be later stage objectives, whereas, things like PK for pediatric populations are things that you might do early in development through an expanded access program. But to make these things valuable, I think it really is worth thinking about in advance and being strategic about what you hope to gain, and that can be very much stage specific. I've seen small companies use this effectively to sort of de-risk their core development program by using or allowing expanded access in non-core development indications, which gives you, again, some optionality if your main development program hits a roadblock, that maybe you find something valuable in a different direction. It is important to think about implementing these things. You need both your objective for the program, but it is also, a little bit like planning a clinical trial or clinical trial light, especially if you're trying to think about a multinational expanded access program. And again, these are things like you wouldn't make a game time decision on a clinical trial, and you should think about expanded access in advance and know what you're going to say. It makes it easier to know if each situation that comes up is consistent with what your corporate objectives are. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you if you want to talk about aligning with the FDA, or if you think we should shift directly into questions. I'm happy to go there as well.
Why don't we, I'll just jump ahead a couple of slides here. Again, there are sponsor considerations. There are issues around expanded access to address regarding the data quality and so forth that we've talked about. But in terms of engaging with FDA, it really does come down to engaging with FDA as early as reasonable within your development program to explore with FDA the utility of expanded access in your program and address the primary questions that you have as part of your overall research and development. And engage with the FDA very collaboratively to talk to them about your methodology to generate and assess data coming from expanded access. And in particular, the important points are reaching agreement on objective endpoints and how you're going to address the potential for bias related to those endpoints, since you're generally dealing with open label, treatment of patients under expanded access, and to build the right process for consistent data collection so that the data that you get are reliable and clinically meaningful. And then overall gain clarity with FDA to understand how FDA is going to view and overall interpret the data that you are generating from expanded access specifically for your program. So I think I will stop there and quickly just jump forward to conclusions so that we can segue into questions. But hopefully, as Mark and I have described, you see that expanded access is a very valuable tool for drug development. There is a great deal of precedence for FDA relying upon expanded access data for approvals of drugs and biologic products. Again, in terms of where you may go with your program, just collaboratively engage with FDA to get alignment, and then, generally understand operationally that the requirements for executing expanded access programs are very similar to what you would do to conduct your overall clinical development program. So I'll stop there and see if we have an opportunity to address a question or two.
Thanks, Kevin. Let's indeed go to our Q&A, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can in the next few minutes. The first one from our audience says, I'm in a situation where as a sponsor, we have an open IND in one indication, and we have an MD who wants to collaborate with us on 1 or 2 patient EAPs in a rare orphan disease. Does this then lead to the PI being the IND holder and all reporting requirements falling under the PI?
I could take that question. I think, it really depends on whether or not the rare disease plausibly falls under the indication of the open research IND. It sounds to me like perhaps not, in which case the most expeditious way would probably be to do an investigator IND, or 2 single patient investigator INDs, providing the product to the investigator who would take on sponsor investigator obligations in that scenario. But, as the manufacturer in that case, you can certainly help them with their obligations. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Next question is, how long does the process typically take for a patient?
It's a good question. I think it's highly variable. It depends on the clinical situation. So, if there's a sponsor or manufacturer that's willing to make a product available for an emergency use, it could take a couple of days. And in that type of emergency setting, there's an after-the-fact notification process that happens. I would say more typically, even for patients like with serious cancer, the process could take anywhere from a week to several weeks, depending on whether or not there's an existing or open program with a sponsor for expanded access, whether or not there's been any patients treated at the institution, what the scale is it consistent with, as mentioned previously, the open IND, or whether or not it's going to require a new IND. I think you'll find in this case, compared to opening a clinical trial, though, that the doors are much more open because people really want to help, I think, and the institution will be, let's say, more amenable to facilitating or fast-tracking things when there's a patient who requires urgent treatment.
Okay. Our next question will be the last one for the hour, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted questions personally after this webinar. And the question is, can any physician submit for expanded access approval?
I think any physician can submit. I mean, at a minimum, you have to be a U.S. licensed to practice medicine. And, the sponsor, if it's done under the sponsor's IND, still needs to make sure that you're qualified by education and training, same as any clinical trial under Part 312. So, I think the answer is it sort of depends. In general, we've taken the position that if, you're treating a patient who's eligible for an expanded access program, then by definition, you're qualified. And I think if that's your position as the sponsor, the FDA will generally accept it. So I think at this point, we can move to our closing statements. As mentioned, we'll follow up on and address other questions individually, but I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Kevin and thank you to Ro. And I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Well, yeah, again, thanks everyone for joining us, and we appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, guys. So thank you all for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.